The first time I smelled it, I honestly thought one of my cows had gotten sick somewhere out in the lower pasture. You know, that heavy, sour smell that hangs in the air and makes the back of your throat tighten before your brain even figures out what you're breathing. Yeah, that kind of smell. By sunset, I was standing in my boots watching raw sewage snake across 40 acres my grandfather had spent half his life turning into good grazing land, while a luxury developer stood at the top of the hill grinning like he'd just won the lottery. Then he looked right at me and said, "This valley belongs to people who matter, and that sure isn't you." Funny thing is, he believed every word of it. My name's Owen Carter, and until all this happened, I figured the best way to deal with difficult people was to leave them alone. I'd spent most of my life doing exactly that. My place sits at the bottom of Cedar Hollow, 40 acres of pasture, old cedar fences, one weathered red barn, a small farmhouse my parents remodeled 30 years ago, and a creek that never seems to dry up no matter how hot Kentucky summers get. The ridge above my property used to be nothing but hardwood forest and grazing land. Then investors showed up. Within 2 years, the trees were gone. Roads were paved, glossy billboards appeared promising luxury mountain living. And suddenly everyone driving through town acted like that ridge had always belonged to expensive houses instead of deer and cattle. The company behind it all was Hollow Crest Development, run by a man named Bryce Langford. If confidence could be bottled, Bryce would have owned the factory. He drove spotless trucks that somehow never touched dirt, wore pressed shirts even at construction sites, and smiled with that look some people get when they've spent too many years surrounded by folks who never tell them no. Around town, people either admired him or stayed out of his way. I was in the second group. At least I thought I was. One Tuesday morning, I noticed excavators working unusually close to my north fence line. Construction crews had been busy for months, so I didn't think much of it. Around lunchtime, one of my neighbors, Earl, drove over on his old tractor and climbed down slower than he used to these days. He scratched his beard, looked toward the ridge, then back at me. "They're laying some mighty big pipe up there," he muttered. I shrugged. "Storm drainage, maybe." Earl didn't answer right away. He just kept staring toward the hill. "Hope they know where it's headed." I laughed because I figured surely somebody had engineers handling all that. Big companies don't just guess where underground utilities go, or at least that's what I believed then. The next afternoon, everything changed. I came back from repairing a fence near the creek and found 3 construction trucks parked less than 50 feet from my property line. A crew had already cut through an embankment and connected a huge drainage line directly into an older concrete channel that crossed my land. Nobody had called. Nobody had knocked on my door. Nobody had even left a note. Before I could ask what was happening, brown water rushed through the channel faster than I'd ever seen rainwater move. Except this wasn't rain. Within minutes, it overflowed into the pasture. The smell hit me so hard my eyes watered. My cattle scattered toward higher ground. I walked straight toward the foreman, trying to stay calm because yelling rarely fixes anything. "Who authorized this?" I asked. He wouldn't even look at me. "Take it up with Mr. Langford." About 20 minutes later, Bryce rolled in driving a black pickup polished enough to reflect the clouds. He stepped out smiling like we were about to discuss barbecue recipes instead of sewage flooding my farm. I pointed toward the pasture. "You planning on explaining this?" He glanced over his shoulder for maybe 2 seconds before laughing under his breath. "Smell that?" he asked. "That's progress." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. That's untreated sewage running across private property. He folded his arms. "Temporary inconvenience. It'll be forgotten once these homes are finished. Not on my land." His smile disappeared just enough to become insulting instead of friendly. "Swimme. My attorneys bill more before lunch than this farm makes in a year." Then, as if that wasn't enough, he walked over to my cedar fence, planted one expensive boot against an old rail my grandfather had installed decades earlier, and deliberately snapped it in half. The crack echoed louder than I expected. He tipped his sunglasses down just enough to meet my eyes. "Welcome to Progress." Then he climbed back into his truck and drove away. I stood there staring at that broken fence rail for a long time. Not because of the wood, which can always be replaced. It was what it represented. Somebody had walked on a land my family had cared for over 3 generations and decided money made him untouchable. The sewage spreading across my pasture wasn't even the part that bothered me most anymore. It was that laugh, that certainty that nobody like me could ever fight back. I remember picking up that broken cedar rail, brushing the dirt off with my thumb, and thinking something my grandfather used to tell me whenever life got unfair. Never wrestle a fool in his own game, son. Make him play yours. I tossed the broken rail into the bed of my truck, looked one last time at the filthy water creeping across my grass, and instead of driving home, I turned toward the county records office. I had no idea what I was looking for yet, only that somewhere beneath that ridge, beneath all their money and promises and shiny new roads, there had to be a truth they hadn't bothered to read. The county records office isn't much to look at. It's an old brick building that still smells like paper, dust, and old coffee, the kind of place where nothing seems to change except the calendar hanging behind the front desk. I walked in carrying that broken fence rail in the back of my truck, not because I thought anyone needed to see it, but because somehow it reminded me why I was there. Mrs. Helen Brooks had worked the archives for longer than I'd been alive. She looked over her glasses when I walked in and smiled. "Morning, Owen. What brings you in?" I told her everything, leaving out only the part where I wanted to drive my truck straight through Bryce Langford's front office. She listened without interrupting, then slowly stood up. "Let's see what history has to say." About 15 minutes later, she disappeared into the storage room and came back carrying a thin yellow folder that looked older than both of us. She brushed the dust off the cover with her sleeve before setting it in front of me. "Original Carter Ranch subdivision records," she said quietly. "Most people never ask for these." I opened the folder expecting little more than survey sketches. Instead, I found the original plat map drawn almost 60 years earlier, complete with handwritten notes, engineering stamps, and one line that immediately caught my attention. Every drainage route coming off the ridge crossed my family's land before reaching the creek. Every single one. Helen pointed to a paragraph typed on brittle paper. "Read that one carefully." I read it once, then again, then a third time just to make sure I wasn't imagining it. Decades before the subdivision ever existed, my grandfather had granted a limited drainage easement to the original ranch owner who once controlled the ridge. It wasn't permanent ownership. It wasn't unrestricted access. It was permission, conditional permission. The agreement required that all water entering our property remain properly treated, environmentally compliant, routinely maintained, and within a maximum recorded flow capacity established by county engineers. Any material violation allowed the landowner to terminate the easement after written notice and a 30-day opportunity to cure the default. I leaned back in my chair and just stared at the page. Helen smiled a little. "Looks like somebody forgot to read the fine print before they built $500,000 worth of houses." I couldn't help laughing for the first time all week. "Or 20 million. She shrugged. "Makes the paperwork even more expensive." I left the courthouse with certified copies of every document, old survey maps, engineering notes, maintenance clauses, and enough legal records to fill half the passenger seat of my truck. But I still needed someone who understood property law better than I did. That's how I ended up sitting across from attorney Rachel Monroe the next morning. Rachel had represented ranchers and farmers for nearly 25 years. She wasn't flashy. Her office overlooked the railroad tracks instead of downtown skyscrapers. And her bookshelf contained more soil reports than legal trophies. She read every page without saying a word. Finally, she looked up and smiled the same way a mechanic smiles after hearing an engine knock he already knows how to fix. "Owen, did you authorize them to increase drainage volume?" "No." "Did you authorize untreated sewage?" "Absolutely not." "Have they exceeded every maintenance requirement listed here?" "Looks that way." She closed the folder. "Then congratulations. They don't have the legal position they think they have." I felt hope for the first time since Bryce laughed in my face. Rachel drafted a formal notice of default that afternoon. 12 pages. Every violation documented. Engineering reports attached. Photographs of contaminated pasture. Environmental references. Veterinary concerns for livestock. Water testing requests. At the bottom sat one sentence that mattered more than everything else combined. Hollow Crest Development had 30 calendar days to restore compliance or risk immediate termination of all drainage rights across Carter property. We mailed it certified with delivery confirmation. 3 days later, I received the envelope back. Someone had torn in half. Across the front, written with a thick black marker, was one word. Q. No signature. No explanation. Just that. Rachel stared at it for several seconds before laying it gently on her desk. Keep this, she said. Judges appreciate arrogance when it's preserved as evidence. The waiting began. Those 30 days felt longer than 30 years. Every morning, I checked the pasture. The sewage kept flowing. The smell never really disappeared. My cows refused to graze near the contaminated area. I spent thousands hauling clean water to temporary tanks while environmental inspectors collected samples from the creek. Earl stopped by nearly every evening, usually pretending he had another excuse. We'd sit on the tailgate, watching the sun disappear behind a ridge. Think he'll fix it? He asked one night. I shook my head. No. Good. I looked over at him. Good. Earl grinned. Men like that only learn expensive lessons. Around the third week, the county environmental office completed its preliminary report. Elevated contamination levels. Untreated discharge. Potential groundwater concerns. Rachel simply added the report to our growing stack of documents. Bryce, meanwhile, acted like nothing was happening. Construction continued. New families toured model homes every weekend. Glossy advertisements promised luxury country living with pristine natural surroundings. I drove past one Saturday and actually watched a sales agent hand bottled water to prospective buyers while untreated sewage from the same development flowed across my pasture less than a mile away. The irony would have been funny if it hadn't been so disgusting. Day 27 arrived. Nothing changed. Day 28. Still nothing. Day 29. Silence. On the evening before the deadline, Rachel called. Ready? She asked. I think so. No, she corrected gently. You're nervous. That's different. She was right. Even knowing the law favored us, shutting down drainage for an entire subdivision wasn't something any reasonable person celebrated. Hundreds of homeowners had trusted the developer. Many had no idea what was happening uphill from my farm. I didn't want innocent families caught in the middle. Rachel understood before I even said it. Remember who created this situation, she told me. Not you. I barely slept that night. At exactly 8:31 the following morning, Rachel filed the petition terminating the easement. By lunchtime, the county recorder stamped it into the public record. At 2 o'clock, she called again. It's official. I climbed into my truck and drove toward the steel control gate my grandfather had installed decades earlier where the drainage channel entered our property. It wasn't hidden. It wasn't improvised. It had existed legally for generations, maintained exactly where the original engineering drawings showed it. I unlocked the protective cover, wrapped both hands around the weather control wheel, and hesitated for just a second. I wasn't thinking about Bryce anymore. I was thinking about Grandpa standing beside me years ago, explaining why every valve, every fence, every survey marker mattered. Land remembers, he'd always say. People forget. Paper doesn't. I took one long breath and slowly turned the wheel until the gate closed completely. Water stopped flowing across my pasture for the first time in weeks. The silence felt almost unreal. I climbed back into my truck, knowing that somewhere above me, on top of that beautiful ridge Bryce Langford believed he owned, gravity had just started working for someone else. I wish I could tell you Bryce exploded the second I closed that gate, but that's not how it happened. For the first few hours, nothing. The ridge looked just as perfect as it had the day before. Fresh pavement, neat sidewalks, shiny model homes, landscapers planting flowers around decorative stone signs. If you'd driven through that afternoon, you would have thought everything was running exactly as planned. Then gravity started doing what gravity has always done. By the next morning, stormwater and wastewater that once flowed harmlessly through my family's drainage easement had nowhere legal to go. Holding ponds filled faster than the engineers expected. Low areas around the newest streets began collecting standing water. By the second day, county inspectors were already receiving complaints from homeowners about strange odors rising from storm drains. Bryce came flying down my driveway before noon, throwing gravel behind his truck. He jumped out before the engine even stopped running. "Open the damn gate," he shouted. "You know exactly what's happening up there." I leaned against my fence and answered as calmly as I could. "Ido. It's called the consequences of violating your easement." His face turned bright red. "I'll have a bulldozer here in an hour." "Touch that gate," I replied, "and you'll add criminal trespass, destruction of private property, and interference with a recorded county action to the list your lawyers already have to explain." For the first time since I'd met him, Bryce had nothing to say. He looked at the gate, then at me, then back toward the ridge before climbing into his truck without another word. By day 3, the county health department posted temporary warning notices throughout portions of the development, while engineers inspected the overloaded drainage system. By day 5, the county issued an official stop work order until Hollow Crest Development restored legal drainage compliance. Prospective buyers canceled appointments almost overnight. For signed purchase contracts were withdrawn before the end of the week. Construction crews stood around waiting for instructions that never came. Every extra day cost Bryce more money than my family had earned in years. A week later, Rachel called. "They're ready to talk." The meeting took place in a conference room overlooking the very subdivision Bryce had once bragged about. This time his expensive suit looked wrinkled, the confidence was gone from his voice, and even his attorney seemed exhausted. Bryce folded his hands on the table and quietly said, "Name your price." I slid a folder across to him without smiling. "It's not a price." He frowned. "Then what is it?" "A contract. The one you should have signed before your crews ever crossed my fence." Rachel opened the document and began reading the terms aloud. A new 15-year drainage agreement. Monthly compensation of $2,500. Annual engineering inspections at Hollow Crest's expense. Mandatory water quality testing. Strict flow limits. Immediate financial penalties for every documented violation. Any future modification require my written approval before construction could begin. Bryce flipped through the pages in silence. At one point he stopped, looked at me, and quietly asked, "You planned all this?" I shook my head. "No, my grandfather did, about 60 years ago." He lowered his eyes, picked up the pen, and signed every page. I noticed the pen actually tore the paper on the second signature because he was pressing so hard. A few weeks later, treated water began flowing through the easement again, exactly the way the original agreement had intended decades before. My pasture recovered slowly. Fresh grass eventually replaced the damaged ground. The cows wandered back without hesitation, as if they had already forgotten the whole mess. In a way, I envied them. People around town still ask if I hate Bryce Langford. Honestly, I don't. Hate takes too much energy. What I do think about sometimes is that broken cedar fence rail I kept hanging in my barn. Visitors assume it's just an old piece of wood. I know better. It's a reminder that arrogance usually isn't defeated by louder voices, bigger fists, or deeper pockets. It's defeated by patience, good records, and the simple fact that the law often favors the person who took the time to understand it. Bryce built beautiful homes on top of that ridge. There's no denying that. But every drop of water leaving those homes still crosses the same valley my grandfather protected all those years ago. The hill may have made him rich, but the valley taught him respect. And that's why, whenever someone tells me one ordinary landowner can't stand up to a powerful developer, I just smile and remember the day one old drainage agreement changed everything. Now I'd love to hear what you think. If you had been standing in my boots the moment Bryce snapped that fence rail and laughed in your face, would you have gone straight to court, confronted him differently, or handled it another way entirely? Share your opinion in the comments, because I'm genuinely curious where you draw the line between protecting your property and taking revenge. If you enjoyed this story and want more real-world conflicts where patience and the law beat arrogance, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you in the next one.